Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The village lay quiet under the heavy blanket of night. The only sound, a soft wind rustling through the leaves. Caitlin leaned against the cold stone wall of her family house, her eyes scanning the horizon, waiting for the next attack. For months, the Dark Army had ravaged the countryside, burning fields, raiding homes, and stealing lives. Her own village had suffered more than its share, and it wouldn't be long before the horrors returned. Her hand gripped the hilt of her sword, its worn leather grip a familiar comfort. She could feel the weight of her responsibility pressing down on her. With each passing day, the village relied more and more on her strength, on her willingness to fight. But brute strength wouldn't be enough, not against magic. The Dark Army cell leader, the sorcerer Morvash, wielded dark powers that no steel could cut through. No matter how many men and creatures she defeated, he would always send more, raining death from the skies with spells and incantation. They needed something more, something that could turn the tide. The villagers spoke of an ancient artifact hidden away in the far reaches of the world. The Shield of the Stars, according to legend, it could deflect any magical attack. With it, Caitlin could face Morvash head-on, protect her home, and perhaps finally end the war that had torn the land apart. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice at her side. Still thinking about the shield? Caitlin turned to see Arthur, the village young mage. He was tall, slender, and looked far too serious for his age. His robes fluttered slightly in the breeze, and his staff glowed faintly with magic. "There's nothing else to think about," Caitlin said, her voice low, but resolute. "If I don't find it, this village is finished." Arthur nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "It sounds a dangerous journey. The desert alone could kill us, and that's before we even think about the mountain." "I know," Caitlin replied, her tone sharp, "but it's our only chance." Arthur sighed. "Well, then I suppose I am coming with you. You'll need someone who can at least try to match Morvash's magic. And besides," he added with a faint smile, "someone has to make sure you don't charge headfirst into a trap." Caitlin gave him a rare smile in return. She knew Arthur was right. His knowledge of magic and ancient lore would be invaluable, but they would need more than just the two of them. "There's someone else we need," Caitlin said, her voice turning serious again. Arthur raised an eyebrow. The night was dark when they reached the edge of the village, where the shadows seemed to gather like a thick, creeping mist. A figure stood waiting, barely visible in the gloom. Lily, the assassin. Caitlin had known her for years, though. She still knew little about her past. Lily moved through the world like a whisper, silent and deadly. No one really knew what had driven her to a life of shadows, but Caitlin had seen her fight. She was as lethal as any blade. "You relate," Lily said softly, her voice carrying an edge of amusement. "We had to convince Arthur," Caitlin replied, glancing at the mage, who merely shrugged. Lily's eyes gleamed in the darkness, a sharp, calculating gaze. "You were really going through with this? The Shield of the Stars? It's not just a fairy tale." Caitlin crossed her arms. "The shield is real, and I'm going to find it." Lily was silent for a moment, her eyes narrowing as she studied Caitlin's face. Then, with a slow, deliberate nod, she stepped forward. "I am it." The journey began at dawn, the sun rising over the hills as Caitlin, Arthur, and Lily left the village behind. Their destination, the Desert of Echoes. The desert was a place of death and madness, where travelers lost themselves in illusions, never to return. It was said the echoes of their screams still drifted on the wind. The three walked in silence for most of the morning, each lost in their own thought. The weight of the task ahead pressed down on them. Even Arthur, usually full of chatter about ancient lore and magical theories, was quiet. As the sun climbed higher, the terrain grew more barren, and the heat became oppressive. By noon, they stood at the edge of the desert, a vast expanse of shimmering sand stretching out before them. Caitlin shielded her eyes from the sun and scanned the horizon. "We will need to move quickly. The desert is treacherous, especially at night." Arthur nodded, gripping his staff a little tighter. "I'll do what I can to help with the heat, but even my magic has limits." Lily said nothing, her face impassive as she adjusted the straps on her leather armor. She moved like a shadow, her footsteps barely leaving a trace in the sand. They stepped into the desert, the heat immediately oppressive and the landscape unnervingly quiet. There was no wind, no sound, just the endless expanse of sand and the sun beating down on them. Hours passed, and with them came the first signs of the desert's magic. At first it was subtle flicker in the corner of their vision, a strange shimmer on the horizon. But as they ventured deeper, the illusions grew stronger. They began to hear voices, faint at first, like whispers carried on the wind. Then the voices grew louder, clearer, until it seemed like they were surrounded by a chorus of people. Caitlin frowned, gripping the hilt of her sword. "Ignore it," she said, her voice steady. "It's just the desert playing trick." But it was easier said than done. The voices weren't just random. They were familiar. Caitlin could hear her mother's soft voice calling out to her, begging her to turn back. Arthur heard the voice of his old master, the one who had cast him out of the Mage Academy for failing a crucial spell. Lily heard a voice she hadn't heard in years, one that made her blood run cold. They pressed on, but the illusions became harder to ignore. The sand began to shift and change, forming images that felt all too real. Caitlin saw her village burning, flames rising high into the sky as the dark army marched through the street. She could hear the screams, smell the smoke. Her hand tightened on her sword, her muscles tensing as the urge to turn back overwhelmed her. Arthur, too, was struggling. He saw himself standing before the mage council, their disappointed faces staring down at him as they stripped him of his title. He could feel the shame, the burning humiliation. The desire to prove himself was strong, almost overpowering. Lily, meanwhile, was locked in her own nightmare. She saw a shadowy figure standing in the distance, watching her with cold, unfeeling eyes. It was a face from her past, one she had tried to forget. The weight of her past sins pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. But then, through the haze of illusion, a voice cut through Caitlin's voice. "Keep moving, it's not real." Her shout snapped them back to reality, and one by one, they pushed the illusions aside. The desert set's magic still tried to claw at their minds, but together they were able to resist. Caitlin led the way, her resolve like a beacon in the dark, and Arthur and Lily followed close behind. Hours later, they reached the edge of the desert, exhausted but alive. The heat was behind them, but ahead lay the towering, frozen peaks of Allure, their jagged, snow-covered summits cutting into the sky like icy teeth. Caitlin wiped the sweat from her brow and took a deep breath. "We've made it this far," she said, her voice strong. "I'll make it the rest of the way." Arthur glanced up at the mountains, his eyes filled with a mixture of awe and fear. "The shield is up there," he said softly. "I can feel it." Lily remained silent, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. But there was a look of determination in her eyes, a silent promise that they would reach their goal no matter what stood in their way. The ascent was brutal, the air was thin, and the biting cold sank deep into their bones, sapping their strength. Every step felt like a battle against the elements, and more than once they had to stop and rest, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The first trial came as they reached the halfway point. A narrow path wound its way up the mountain, but blocking their way was a massive ice golem, its body made of solid frozen rock. It stood motionless, its eyes glowing with a faint blue light. Caitlin stepped forward, drawing her sword. "I'll handle this." Arthur frowned. "Be careful, that thing isn't. It's just made of ice. It's enchanted." Caitlin nodded, her grip tightening on her sword. She knew what she had to do. The golem was strong, but she was stronger. With a battle cry, Caitlin charged forward, her sword slicing through the air. The golem moved with surprising speed, its massive arms swinging down to crush her. Caitlin was faster, dodging to the side and slashing at the creature's sled. The blade struck true, sending a shower of ice shards flying through the air. The golem let out a low, rumbling roar and swung again, but Caitlin was ready. She ducked under its arm and drove her sword deep into its chest. The golem staggered, its body cracking as the magic that held it together began to unravel. With one final swing, Caitlin brought her sword down on the golem's head, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. The creature crumbled to the ground, its icy remains scattering across the snow. Breathing heavily, Caitlin sheathed her sword and turned to her companions, let her keep moving. The battle against the ice golem had left them exhausted, but there was no time to rest. Caitlin's muscles burned with fatigue, but her resolve had only hardened. Arthur and Lily followed her lead as they pressed further into the mountain. The wind howled, whipping snow into their faces, and the path grew narrower with each step, forcing them to move in single file. Arthur kept his eyes trained ahead, occasionally muttering spells under his breath to ward off the cold. His magic was limited, and he was saving his strength for whatever lay ahead, but even his small enchantments provided some relief from the relentless wind. Lily, silent as always, moved like a shadow behind them, her eyes scanning the rocky outcrops for any sign of danger. They soon reached a large stone archway carved into the mountainside, its surface etched with ancient runes. Arthur paused, staring at the marking. "This is it," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "The second trial." Caitlin looked at the archway, her brow furrowing. "What kind of trial?" Arthur ran his fingers over the runes, his eyes narrowing as he concentrated. "Knowledge," he said, "a test of the mind. We need to solve a riddle to pass through." Caitlin glanced at him. "Do you know it?" Arthur shook his head. "Not yet, but I will." They stood in silence for a moment, the cold seeping into their bones. Then with a deep breath, Arthur stepped forward. As he crossed the threshold of the archway, the runes began to glow, and a voice deep and ancient boomed from the stone. "I am light as a feather, yet no man can hold me for long. What am I?" Arthur's mind raced. He had studied ancient magic for years, had read countless tomes on riddles and puzzles, but this one felt different. The answer was on the edge of his consciousness, just out of reach. He closed his eyes, focusing on the words, repeating them in his mind. "Light as a feather," he murmured, "but no man can hold me." Caitlin watched him, her hand on her sword, ready for whatever might happen if they failed. But Arthur Shan's brow furrowed in concentration, and after a moment his eyes snapped open. "Breath," he said, his voice strong. "The answer is breath." As soon as the words left his mouth, the runes flared with light and the archway opened, revealing a narrow path that led deeper into the mountain. Arthur exhaled a sigh of relief and turned to Caitlin and Lily. "We can move on," he said. They passed through the archway, the path beyond it winding upward into the heart of the mountain. The air grew colder, the wind fiercer, but they pressed on, driven by the knowledge that the shield of the stars was close. Hours passed, and the ascent became steeper, the path more treacherous. Ice coated the rocks, and one misstep could send them plummeting to the jagged rocks below. Caitlin led the way, her eyes focused on the path ahead, while Lily moved silently behind her, ever watchful. At last they reached a cavern entrance, its mouth dark and foreboding. Inside, the third trial awaited them. Lily stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she studied the shadows within. "This one's mine," she said, her voice low, as though a test of stealth. "Stay here." Caitlin started to protest, but Lily silenced her with a glance. "You will just slow me down," she said. "Trust me." Without another word, Lily slipped into the cavern, her movements so fluid and silent that she seemed to merge with the shadows. Caitlin and Arthur exchanged a glance, both knowing that there was nothing they could do. But wait. Minutes passed in silence, then a faint sound, like the shifting of stone, echoed from within the cave. Caitlina's hand went to her sword, but Arthur shook his head. "Trust her," he said quietly. More minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity. But then at last, Lily emerged from the darkness, a faint smirk on her lip. "It's done," she said. "We can go in." Caitlin and Arthur followed her into the cavern inside. The air was cold and still, and the walls were lined with ancient carvings that depicted long-forgotten battle. In the center of the chamber stood a pedestal, and upon it, glowing with a soft, ethereal light, was the shield of the stars. Caitlin approached the pedestal, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the power emanating from the shield, a warmth that seemed to reach out and wrap around her. She hesitated for a moment, her fingers hovering over the shield's surface. This was it, the moment she'd been fighting for. With a deep breath, she lifted the shield from its resting place. As soon as her hand touched it, the cavern seemed to pulse with energy, and the weight of the shield settled in her grasp. It was lighter than she expected, but she could feel the immense power it contained. Arthur and Lily stepped forward, watching as Caitlin strapped the shield to her arm. "Are you ready?" Arthur asked, his voice soft. Caitlin nodded, her gaze steely. "I am." The final leg of their journey took them to the Sky City, an ancient floating fortress that had once been a place of peace and wisdom, but had long since fallen under the control of the Dark Army. The city hovered in the sky, its towers gleaming in the light of the setting sun, but beneath its beauty lay a dark heart. Morvash, the dark sorcerer who led the Dark Army, had made it his stronghold. They had no choice but to infiltrate the city. Lily took the lead, guiding them through the narrow, winding streets that led to the central tower. Shadows clung to the walls, and the air was thick with the tension of an impending battle. Morvash's forces were everywhere, but Lily's skill allowed them to move undetected, slipping through the city like ghosts. At last, they reached the tower. Its doors were guarded by two hulking figures, their eyes glowing with the unmistakable light of dark magic. But Caitlin wasn't too afraid. She had the shield of the stars. She could face anything. With a determined nod, Caitlin stepped forward. The guards moved to block her path, but she raised a shield, and the magic that emanated from them fizzled out as it struck the shield's surface. In one swift motion, she dispatched both guards, their bodies crumpling to the ground. They entered the tower, the air inside heavy with dark energy. At the top of the tower, Morvash awaited them, his dark robes billowing around him as he stood before a massive window that looked out over the city. So Morvash said, his voice cold and mocking, "You've come to challenge me. You think that shield will save you." Caitlin stepped forward, the shield held high. "I am not here for me," she said, her voice strong and unwavering. "I am here to stop you." Morvash laughed, a low menacing sound. "Foolish girl," he sneered. "You don't try and understand the power I wield. I will destroy you, and your shield will crumble to dust." Without warning, he unleashed a wave of dark magic, the energy crackling through the air like lightning. But Caitlin stood firm, the shield glowing brightly as it absorbed the attack. Morvash's magic was powerful, but the shield was stronger. The battle raged on, the air thick with the clash of magic and steel. Arthur fought alongside Caitlin, his spells striking Morvash, saw minions as they poured into the chamber. Lily moved through the shadows, taking out enemies with swift, precise strike. But it was Caitlin who stood at the center of the battle, her shield gleaming like a beacon of hope in the darkness. With each strike, Caitlin could feel the shield drawing on her strength, the magic within it demanding more and more of her. She knew the price of wielding such power, but she didn't care. She would give everything to protect her home, to save her people. At last, with a final desperate surge of power, Caitlin struck Morvash down. The dark sorcerer crumpled to the floor, his body dissolving into ash as the dark magic that had sustained him was broken. The battle was over. The dark army was defeated. Caitlin stood in the center of the chamber, her breath coming in, ragged gasps. The shield's set glow began to fade, and with it, Caitlin felt her strength slipping away. She had known the cost. She had accepted it. Arthur and Lily rushed to her side, but it was too late. The shield's sun magic had taken its toll. "I am sorry," Caitlin whispered, her voice weak. "I had to do it." Arthur knelt beside her, his eyes filled with sorrow. "You saved us all," he said, softly. Caitlin smiled, her eyes closing as she took one final breath. "That's all I wanted."